A girl disappeared from her home under very strange circumstances. What happened next was more reminiscent of an incredibly twisted movie plot than a real case. It was very hard to believe what happened, because such a combination of events is extremely rare. When the unexpected truth was revealed 15 years later, it only made things worse. Jessica Dishon was born on the 2nd of May, called Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet and peaceful place where most of the residents farmed and knew each other. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, who she had to look after from an early age while her parents were at work. The girl was therefore very independent, and Mom and Dad could always rely on her. When she was 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car. She wanted a red Pontiac, and after a few years she had enough money set aside to buy it. Despite working part-time, Jessica had time to excel at learning and planned to go to college after high school to study accounting. In the fall of that time, when she was 17, Jessica entered her senior year. The girl also began dating a boyfriend and was very excited about the relationship. The morning of Friday, September 10th, began as usual. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Then her younger brothers went to the bus stop and got on the school bus. The girl stayed at home alone and had to drive to school in her car. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, her mother came home and immediately noticed something strange. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, even though she was supposed to be in class at the time. The woman entered the house and went into her daughter's room. Her first thought was that Jessica hadn't heard the alarm clock and might have overslept for school. However, she was not in her bedroom. Then she thought that her daughter might have asked her father to take her to school for some reason. She called her husband, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. The mother assumed there was a problem with Jessica's car and took the spare key from home to try to start it. But when she approached the car, she was met with a very unsettling sight. The driver's door was slightly ajar, and her daughter's cell phone was lying on the seat. There were 2 numbers on the display, 9 and 1. Jessica's sneaker and car keys were under the seat, and her school books, work clothes, and handbag were on the back seat. The woman immediately thought of the worst. It was almost obvious that she had tried to enter the emergency number on her cell phone, but she hadn't had time. Besides, Jessica couldn't possibly have left all her belongings in the car and gone somewhere on foot. She lived on the outskirts of town, so she would have had to walk several kilometers on the road. The parents called the school, where they were told that the girl had not turned up for lessons. According to school policy, the school should have contacted and informed the relatives much earlier, but for some reason they did not. A few hours later, Jessica's parents received a call from her best friend, with whom they worked at the restaurant. She said that the girl hadn't shown up for her shift. This worried them even more. The parents then decided to call the police and drove to the sheriff's office. They stated that their daughter had missed school and work, and that all of her belongings had been left in the unlocked car, including a cell phone with the numbers 9 and 1 dialed. Here, however, another problem awaited them. The sheriff explained that the girl had probably just gone somewhere and would be back home sooner or later, so he advised them to wait until the next day. He was also not fazed by the fact that there was only 1 sneaker left in the car, without which the girl could hardly go anywhere. Jessica's parents were furious and tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger. However, the policeman refused to listen, and they were forced to return home. In the end, The parents had to act on their own. They called all their relatives, acquaintances, and friends, but none of them were Jessica. Together with them, they drove through the city, but they couldn't find the girl. The next morning, the parents came to the sheriff again and said that their daughter had still not returned. This time, the sheriff decided to send 2 officers to the house to investigate Jessica's car, but there was another problem. The officers were extremely unprofessional. They examined the car without gloves, touching the interior and all the items inside. Then they simply drove away without taking anything with them and without even looking into the girl's room, which is required by all regulations. The parents had to get their money's worth again. They turned to the local media, reported on the disappearance of their daughter, and on the fact that the police had absolutely no interest in the case. Together with relatives and friends, they started their own search, and also printed many leaflets with information about the girl's disappearance. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother Stanley. They knew the area well and tried to find out where the girl was most likely to be found. At this point, they feared that Jessica was already dead, so the brother suggested combing the area near the local river. This place had a bad reputation with the locals. It was overgrown and inaccessible, so various criminal activities often took place there, from the sale and consumption of illegal substances to murders. The girl's relatives searched the place for several hours but found nothing. The next day, something very strange happened. Jessica's parents were at home and their son was playing in the garden. At some point he ran into the house and said he heard a scream. He thought it was Jessica's voice. The girl's father grabbed his firearm and ran outside to find out where the scream was coming from. At the same moment, his brother drove up to the house and immediately joined him. Soon they noticed smoke coming from their neighbor's property, 40-year-old David Brooks. As they got closer, they saw that the man was burning what looked like clothing on his property. This seemed suspicious to them, and Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to look around his property. However, the man refused and demanded that they leave. The relatives of the missing girl noticed another oddity. Before all these events, they had normal relations with Brooks and his family. But almost immediately after Jessica's disappearance, he began to behave strangely. The man began to regularly drive past her house at slow speeds, watching her and smiling. Then Jessica's parents began receiving strange phone calls in which the unknown man remained silent and breathed into the receiver. They believed Brooks was doing this, but could not explain the reasons for this behavior. After burning some clothes on his property, Jessica's parents decided to contact the police again, who still had not joined the search. They explained the situation, and the officers went to Brooks' house with search dogs. They were given Jessica's belongings to sniff and pointed out ashes from the fire, but no actionable evidence was found. The dogs also found black gloves in one of the sheds where they detected a cadaverous odor. Throughout this time, Brooks was acting very strangely, and as the officers approached the ashes, his suspicious behavior increased significantly. Still, the police officers saw no direct connection to Jessica's disappearance, so once again she came away with nothing. Jessica's parents were once again frustrated by the police's actions, and so her father decided to call in the FBI. Although the FBI does not normally start investigating cases after receiving a call from relatives of missing persons, this time they decided to get involved immediately. After hearing all the disturbing facts discovered by the girl's parents, they came to the conclusion that something terrible might indeed have happened to her. From that point on, the real investigation began, which the police refused to do. The FBI agents took fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car and took all possible evidence to the lab for examination. At the same time, investigators organized an extensive search of the area with the help of helicopters and volunteers. The bottom of a pond near the girl's home was also thoroughly searched to determine if her body could be there. The FBI agents also searched the Brooks farm thoroughly, and a very disturbing find awaited them in one of the sheds. There was a printed photograph of Jessica. After that, the investigators had little doubt that Brooks was involved in the case. They also suspected that his very older brother Joseph was involved, as he was also behaving very strangely. However, they had a problem. During the search, the investigators found no evidence that would have allowed them to arrest the brothers. So they concentrated entirely on the search. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica's disappearance, the police received a call that left almost no doubt that the girl was already dead. A woman was driving along the road near the river, where the girl's father and his friends had been looking for her for the first few days. As she drove past a tree a few dozen meters from the road, she saw something strange and stopped. As the woman got closer, she realized that something that looked like a human body was lying next to the tree and immediately called the police. FBI agents arrived at the scene and indeed found a dead girl there. She was missing several fingers and limbs. There was a rope with traces of red and silver paint on her legs. Some of her clothes were missing. From this, the investigators concluded that the perpetrator had abused her. Due to the level of decomposition, they could not visually confirm that it was Jessica, so they sent officers to her home and asked her parents to help identify her. The girl's father couldn't bring himself to look at his dead daughter, but her mother agreed. When she arrived, she couldn't tell from the face if it was really Jessica, but she immediately saw a small butterfly tattoo on her body. It was exactly the same as her daughter's. The coroners confirmed the identity of the deceased and determined that the cause of death was strangulation. They also found numerous abrasions on her body. In addition, the experts found that her limbs and fingers were severed from her body after her death. Another fact was a real blow to Jessica's parents. It turned out that she was alive for about 3 days after her disappearance. It turned out that the police had a real chance of rescuing her. However, they did not take any steps in that direction. After finding the body, the FBI agents decided to question Brooks again, and here something interesting awaited them. In their first interview, the man said he had seen Jessica near her house the morning she disappeared. But now he changed his story and claimed he hadn't seen her that day. Instead, he was allegedly at home in bed with his wife. However, when investigators questioned her, the woman denied her husband's statements. The FBI officers then asked him what he would have done if they had found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Nothing of the sort was found, but Brooks's answer seemed as suspicious as possible. He said that he should have confessed to everything in the case. He later failed a lie detector test and the FBI decided to take the case to trial. They realized that the chances of a conviction were pretty slim, because they couldn't find any direct evidence linking Brooks to the murder. All they had was a series of disturbing but highly indirect clues to his involvement. So they kept working on the case, looking for more evidence. While preparing for the trial, the investigators remembered another interesting detail. During the search of Brooks' car, they found a rope that was very similar to the rope used to bind the victim's legs. However, No DNA samples were found on them, so this evidence also fell into the circumstantial category. The trial did not begin until January 2003. Brooks' defense attorney clung to the complete lack of evidence. It turned out as it went on. When the body was discovered, investigators also found some of the victim's missing limbs, placed them in special containers, and for some reason handed them over to the local police. They ignored the large, "keep in the fridge" signs and left the containers at room temperature. This caused the whole thing to decompose almost completely. Even if some evidence could have been extracted from them, including possible DNA traces of the murderer, it all disappeared because of a mistake. All other circumstantial evidence pointing to Brooks's guilt also lacked strength, and in the end, the jury could not agree on a verdict. As a result, the man was released on bail. After that, he could only be charged with the crime again under state law if new evidence was found. This was a big blow for Jessica's parents. They had little doubt that Brooks was behind her murder. Moreover, their daughter could have been saved if the police had taken their work seriously. Eventually, they lost all hope that they would get justice. Over the next few years, the case dragged on until it was finally practically abandoned. This often continued until the year when a new detective, Lynn Hunt, was brought into the local office. She was assigned to reopen old, unsolved cases, and the first one she turned her full attention to was Jessica's murder. After familiarizing herself with the case files, she was shocked by the unprofessionalism of her predecessors. Almost all the documents were filled out incorrectly. Conversations with the parties involved were not mentioned. The evidence was not properly formalized. In other words, it was all so useless that she practically had to start the investigation from scratch. 13 years after the murder, the first people she spoke to were the girl's relatives. One of her brothers, who was now an adult, lived separately from his parents. He gave her a box of Jessica's belongings from her car, which he had kept since the police had returned the family's belongings. Hunt was once again surprised that her colleagues had been so careless with the evidence and had not stored it as they should have done. Now, after all these years, all these items were hardly able to shed any light on what had happened. Nevertheless, she continued to examine everything she could find. Soon she found an interesting detail among the documents: Brooks' medical examination report. It stated that the man's IQ was only 61 points, which was considered extremely low. This called into question all police actions, including the interrogation of Brooks. With that level of intelligence, he might not have understood most of the questions he was asked, and he might not have given the most meaningful answers. All of this led her to conclude that perhaps the man had nothing to do with the case at all, as his strange behavior was easily explained by his extremely low IQ. Then Hunt began to wonder who else might have committed the murder. She spent a lot of time investigating everyone involved in the case or who simply lived nearby. This lasted until September of the year, almost exactly 15 years after Jessica's death. The detective received a call from a colleague from another judicial authority. He told him that he had received an interesting tip. In a state prison in Kentucky, one of the inmates had said that he knew the true identity of Jessica Dishon's murderer. Hunt viewed this tip with a certain degree of skepticism. When inmates tried to give information to the police, it usually ended in frustration and a waste of time. Most of them invented stories in order to get parole or better conditions. However, she realized that she couldn't help but verify this information. She traveled to the prison and met with a man who supposedly had the information. According to him, he had shared a cell for a time with a man who had been convicted of abuse of minors, the same offense for which he himself had been imprisoned. On this basis, the perverts became friends and told each other details of the crimes they had committed. One day, a cellmate told him that he had killed Jessica Dishon, among others. And then the informant told the detective the man's name, which shocked the woman. It was Stanley Duchamp, Jessica's maternal uncle and her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had abused the girl for several years as a child when he lived in her house and threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she told what was going on. When Jessica openly met a boyfriend in the spring, Stanley began to fear that sooner or later she would confess to him what her own uncle had done to her. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley came to her house when the girl was there alone. She was about to get into her car and had already thrown all her things in when he came up to her and demanded that she break up with this man immediately. Jessica refused to listen to him and threatened to tell him about his abuse if he didn't leave her alone. He began to threaten her, whereupon the girl picked up the phone and tried to call 911. Stanley then tried to grab her, but Jessica freed herself and ran into the house. The man followed her into her room, beat her and wrapped the girl in her sheets, before taking her to an abandoned shed, which was not far from where her body was later found. Stanley held her captive there for several days and abused her. He then killed her, dragged her body outside so it could be discovered, and buried the sheet in the ground beneath the shed. He also revealed that he had removed some of the victims' limbs after the murder to make the police believe they were drug dealers. Detective Hunt pointed out that this information had never been passed on. Only the next of kin knew that the girl was missing limbs, so the informant could not have made it up. Finally, he added that Stanley had buried Jessica's sneaker under a broken tree near the shed. Hunt immediately decided to follow up on all this information about buried evidence. Since the local police department was understaffed, no one could help her with the case. So she reached out to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives who agreed to join the search. The woman did not tell them that Stanley could be the killer, as she first needed to find confirmation of these shocking allegations. On the first day of the search, they found no clues. In the pouring rain, they dug in places that matched the informant's description, but to no avail. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt went there again, and on the way, the man pointed out an abandoned shed to the detective. They drove there and started digging in the ground, and almost immediately they had a pleasing breakthrough. They found a buried sheet. Hunt immediately rushed to Jessica's house. In all these years, her parents had made no changes to her room. It was exactly as it had been on the day her daughter disappeared. So the detective easily determined that the sheet they found belonged to Jessica's bedding. It was missing from the bed, and the rest of the bedding had the same pattern. Stanley was then arrested and brought in for questioning. The man refused to confess to his actions, but during the interview with the investigators, he was literally shaking. He was eventually arrested. The case was brought to court. Jessica's father could not believe that his brother had done such a thing to his daughter. He completely denied it for a long time, but over time he got used to this unbearable fact. Later, the man remembered that it was Stanley who, in the first days of the disappearance, suggested that he search for the body near the river. But then, during the search, he suddenly felt sick and took his brother home. It turned out that this was only a few hundred meters from the shed where the girl lay. Apparently, Stanley had misled them in this way and prevented them from discovering the girl alive. In preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt continued to research the suspect's past to find more clues. She already knew that he was in prison for abusing another girl in her family, but something else soon came to light. Several other women who were closely related to Stanley had told the police that he had abused them when they were young. The incidents all followed the same pattern. The man would visit his relatives as he had no home of his own at the time. When he was alone with the girls, the pervert carried out his dirty deeds and silenced them with threats. From all these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all this, Detective Hunt realized it would be difficult to secure a murder conviction because there was little direct evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints and DNA. She continued digging through the case until she came across a box of papers that she had not yet looked through. As she examined the contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the mediocrity of her predecessors who had handled the case in the early years. Inside the box was a letter dated June 25th of the year 2002. In it, another police informant wrote the same thing that Hunt learned 12 years later from an inmate in a Kentucky prison. At the time of the summer 2002, Stanley was already in prison for molesting a minor relative. Even then, he told his cellmate that he had killed Jessica. The entire cell, also not cooperating with the police, wrote a letter to the police department in charge of the case detailing what Stanley had done to his niece and how. And what do you think the police did? They simply ignored the letter. Apparently they were convinced at the time that Brooks had something to do with it, so they didn't even consider other suspects. Hunt was disappointed with the behavior of her colleagues. After all, without their mistakes, the case could have been solved in 2002. But now, after all these years, she could only wait for the trial and hope that the man would be punished for his actions. The trial began 2015 and Stanley pleaded not guilty. Jessica's parents, who were present, could hardly take their eyes off their relative who had ruined their lives. They were also angry that he was unable to alleviate their suffering and confess what he had done. The prosecution was aware that the chances of a murder conviction were very slim. As for the cases of abuse of the other female relatives, there was a problem here too. Each of them would have to stand before the jury and tell in great detail what Stanley had done to them and listen to his lawyer try to make them out to be liars. After careful consideration, the man was offered a plea deal with the prosecution. The prosecution agreed to waive the death penalty if Stanley pleaded guilty to abuse of female relatives and involuntary manslaughter of Jessica. The man eventually agreed and pleaded guilty under the terms of the deal. To the annoyance of the victim's parents, he was not allowed to reveal any details about his actions. They wanted Stanley to tell the whole truth, but he kept his mouth shut. According to the agreement, the murderer received 20 years in prison with the right to apply for parole after 15 years. Since he was 56 years old at the time of sentencing, Stanley could be released at 71. Jessica's father said afterward that if his brother didn't die in prison, he would wait for his release so he could punish him himself. In 2019, Stanley was questioned for the first time and stated that he had not killed Jessica. He said he had been at work that morning, but after 2 decades it was impossible to confirm this. He also couldn't explain how 2 informants who didn't know each other could hack out identical stories with facts that could only have been known to the killer. As for David Brooks, investigators still haven't ruled out his involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and may have asked him to help him dispose of the victim's belongings and body. Considering Brooks' low intelligence level, he may not have even realized the gravity of the situation. It is possible that the girl's clothes and gloves, on which the dogs smelled the corpse odor, were burned in that fire because Stanley gave them to him. He may have left Jessica's photo in his shed to frame the man. We don't know if it's true, though. Brooks died that year of heart problems. We also want to remember the moment when, on the third day of Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help outside the house and thought it was his sister. To this day, we cannot say with absolute certainty what it was. She should have been alive at the time, but Stanley had kept her in a shed a few miles from their home. It is likely that the child only heard it in all the stress, or that someone else was screaming. But there is also a more unlikely version. As we recall, immediately after Jessica's father ran outside, Stanley drove up to the house. That means he was nearby. We could assume that the girl was sitting in his car with her mouth taped shut or unconscious. But that theory seems unlikely.